So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining the Garrison Institute Pathways to Planetary Health Forum. I'm Jonathan Rose, the co-founder of the Garrison Institute. Before we begin today's session, let's review a few logistical items about our gathering. We're on a Zoom webinar, and so participant audio and video will remain off for the duration of the webinar. Please direct any questions to the Q&A box below, and I will try and integrate those into the discussion towards the end of the discussion. We're recording these sessions, and you'll have a chance to view these recordings, as well as a schedule of upcoming programs and all the other amazing sessions that we've recorded at www.garrisoninstitute.org. So if you like this one, we encourage you to share it. This interactive online event is part of the Pathways to Planetary Health Forum Summer Series of 2022, in which we explore the topics of regeneration across 4 pathways: half Earth, ecological civilization, regenerative economics, and the common good. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest and my friend, Michelle Moore. Michelle is the CEO of Groundswell, a not-for-profit that builds community power by connecting clean energy, economic development, affordability, and quality of life. She's an amazing social entrepreneur. She was the former White House official. She was the National Environmental Executive, if I remember, with roots in rural Georgia. She's a relentless agent for change. Her accomplishments range from delivering programs that cut energy use by $11 billion, while leading to the development of 3.2 gigawatts of renewable energy, while leading sustainability for the Obama administration, to developing Lead into a globally recognized brand as Senior Vice President of USGBC. And that's where I met Michelle when she was working on a Lead for Cities program. Michelle currently serves as the executive advisory board for the American Flood Coalition, the board of directors for DHI Studio. Her work is deeply rooted in her faith and the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
And wait, before we go any further, we have to show the latest part of your bio, which is you just published, or it'll be out. And when will this book be out?
It is officially out August 16th, and you can order copies online.
Right. And it's a little complicated what I'm going to say, but number one, I deeply want everybody to support their local bookstore. But if you do pre-order it through Amazon, that kind of helps boost its ranking there, which is helpful to Michelle. So you can choose whichever one you want to do. I'm going to turn off the screen share, and in the chat box, you'll see a link to be able to the book. And as interesting ideas come up in this conversation, the Garrison Institute amazing crew will instantly find those ideas and put links to them in the chat box, so you can keep watching the chat box for other ideas. Okay, so I'm going to stop the screen share. Hello, Michelle.
Hello, Jonathan. It's a blessing to be here with everybody this afternoon, and I am actually joining us all here today from my hometown of LaGrange, Georgia. I'm sitting in my friend Jaja Hurd's office. She's the CEO of the LaGrange Housing Authority. She's celebrating her 30th, actually it's over here, 30th wedding anniversary today. And it is, and it's such a wonderful place. This is the first discussion that I'm having about the book, because your work and your writing has been such an inspiration to me. Thank you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you. So let's start in LaGrange. So you were born there. Yes. It's different now than it was when you were born. What was it like when you were growing up in LaGrange?
Well, you know, LaGrange is it's a small town in a rural county. It's right on the Georgia-Alabama line, about an hour south of Atlanta. And it was a textile town. You know, when I was born in 72, it was just as that entire industry was leaving the United States, and the community had really been hollowed out. And, you know, LaGrange, like so many towns throughout the South and so many towns everywhere, you know, had also been deeply formed, and I would say deformed, by segregation and racist policies that had continued in different forms in this community until the early 1990s. And, you know, growing up and seeing not only how, you know, my own grandparents lived, my mama, papa, Moore, and Nop, who all worked in the textile mills their whole lives, you know, paid those crazy big energy bills, you know, $450, $500 a month if it got hot or cool, but also seeing how differently, my Black and African American neighbors and community members lived, even versus my grandparents. And, so seeing those disparities in my hometown and, learning about how we could all work together to do justice and heal our communities through energy was an important part of the inspiration for writing this book.
And an important part of inspiration for your work.
Yes, sir.
And I think one of the reasons why we're really shining a light on you and your work today is, so what percentage of America's rural poor live in rural areas?
Oh my goodness. If we think about it just in terms of like rural communities, rural areas, and the utilities that serve those rural communities, because they're different than the utilities that serve big towns, right? It's rural electric cooperatives, local nonprofit utilities serve rural America. And those rural co-ops serve 90% of the persistent poverty counties in America, 90%. And if we think about it from an energy burden perspective, who's paying the most for their electricity to keep the lights on, energy burdens can be, very high and, hurt families in urban areas, but energy burdens are even higher in rural places and communities like LaGrange. The most energy burdened county in Georgia is Union County. It's rural county in North Georgia. And low-income households in Union County pay an average of more than 36% of their entire household income for electricity. So the disparities are deep, and the solutions are different. They're different, than they are in urban areas that are served by big investor-owned utilities.
So I just want to take us through this again. 36%.
Mm-hmm.
So these are families that are often spending more than 50% of their income on rent or mortgage if they have one. So there's 86%.
Yeah.
Got to have fuel to get to work because they got to drive to work, most of them. There's not a lot of money left for food or clothes or
anything else.
after-school education programs or anything else. So actually reducing that burden from 36% to 15% or something like that. What's the, for a middle-class non-rural family, how much do they typically spend? What percentage of their income on energy?
I believe it is, you are considered to be energy burdened, so it's higher than it should be.
Yeah.
If you're spending more than 6% of your entire household income on your electricity.
So they're spending 30% of their income more,
yeah,
which is an astounding amount. So this work really makes a difference. And I don't want to get super political about it, but if we can help solve this problem and a rural population learns that renewable energy can be a pathway to more economic sustainability for themselves, it might help align that population more with the climate change agenda.
Well, and I think that it's, from my perspective, as you shared even in your intro, it's really about, me personally, faith, but also just loving our neighbors. We don't even need to think about it in political terms and
Right.
with regard to the direction, it's just how do we help people? And as we think about clean energy, as we think about the same solutions, that also solve climate change, those are also the same solutions that are going to cut people's bill to something that's affordable. And, when we think about this extraordinary transition, that we're going through, that we're driving, that we're experiencing, we all got different seats in the car, in the EV truck, if you look at the cover of the book. We all have different roles, but there are so many wonderful ways to really deeply embed the economic value, the supply chains, the benefits, the economic benefits of these kinds of technologies into economic revitalization, in ways that are healing not only in terms of climate and environment, healing in terms of public health, but healing in terms of pocketbooks. These are kitchen table issues. It's not just stuff for Congress to talk about. It's not just stuff to shout in the wind at Washington. It's stuff to really bring to your hometown in a way that, that benefits everybody in ways that matter, in ways that matter at the kitchen table.
Fantastic. So let's go back to the beginning of this whole rural electric system and its emergence in the 1930s.
So, when I was researching this book, it was so eye-opening to me, the many, many ways in which the story of the electrification of America is so similar to the transformation that we're going through now. In the early 1930s, rural America didn't have electricity. The big private utility companies at the time said that it was too expensive. It's too expensive to run lines out to the farm, too expensive to run lines to small towns that didn't have the density, the commercial density that they were looking for to be able to earn a profit for their shareholders. I'm sure that some of you guys are probably nodding and thinking, wow, that sounds a lot like broadband. Yes, it is exactly like broadband. So in the 1930s, as a part of the New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the federal government created some institutions to help electrify the farm. And those included TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. It included the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration. And we also had at the same time, small towns, farming communities, just really taking matters into their own hands and self-organizing into rural electric cooperative utilities, which were enabled by state legislation and received funding and financing support from the federal government at the time, and also municipal utilities, where the utility was organized as a unit of local government. And there are more than 900 rural electric cooperatives still today. And when we think about public power, so that's municipal utilities and rural electric cooperative utilities, there are more than 2,000, so there are many, many people, about 30% of the population, that are served by these small, local, nonprofit utilities, very different than the behemoths, like the Georgia Power, the Southern Company, the Exelons, the Con Eds, that we're used to kind of dealing with. These are local folks. And they're still doing the same work that they were created to do then, which was not just about electricity, it was about economic development and quality of life. Same issues that we're facing today with clean energy. Energy is the mother of all industries. And we've got these beautiful tools that we can go back and reconsider and reform to do 21st century work instead of 19th century work.
So let's talk about, I want to delve into this form of ownership, because you've said 900 rural electric co-ops. So that means owned by the members, and another 1,100 municipal systems, which means owned by the public. Yes. So we have always, there's been this thing since the 1980s that, only the private sector can do things the best and it's the most efficient. But you're describing a 2,000 unit system that's serving a tremendous amount of the American population, that is really working on what I'm going to call as a system based on mutuality versus on capitalism.
It is. It's a very different system. And, when we think about cooperatives and rural electric cooperatives, even that National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, they're part of an international movement that's about shared ownership and member control. And I think that that's something that often gets, lost in the sauce, when we're talking about our energy system, just in terms of the type of electrons that we're using, that there are these institutions that were created, were formed on principles, that are still internationally adopted principles today, that centers energy democracy. We don't always use them that way, but energy democracy is what they were created to be.
Okay, so do we, by the way, we could use more cooperative systems of democracy. So how are they, my understanding, you can take us through the history briefly, because some of them became less democratic, but there's a real focus on democracy. And how is that democracy now focused on bringing renewable energy to these communities?
Well, I want to uplift actually a dear friend, a mentor, and just a real hero and inspiration to me, to whom I actually dedicated the book. And that is Mr. Curtis Wynn. And Curtis is now the CEO of one of the biggest cooperative utilities in the country down in Orlando. And he was previously the CEO of Roanoke Electric Cooperative, which is in Northern and Eastern Carolina. So it's East Carolina. And Roanoke Electric Cooperative, served one of the poorest with multi-generational long-term poverty, not a ton of economic activity, communities in the state. And I will tell you, not just because I read about it, or not just because I'm a fan of Curtis, I have been there and seen it with my own eyes. Curtis Wynn built the utility of the future at Roanoke Electric Cooperative. And it was Curtis's vision and his leadership and the extraordinary team that he has there. Roanoke is now led by Marshall Cherry, but it has EV charging, special EV rates, energy efficiency programs that work for everybody, community solar with energy storage that's being developed in a way to be restorative and protect and preserve Black land ownership. It has just extraordinary ways to use the unique cooperative business model and the cooperative ownership and control model, where it's owned and controlled by its members, to take the value, the different economic benefits that are connected to all these different types of sources of generation, energy services, and put them back into the community, like sharing savings from solar and distribution scale energy storage from the utility, and connecting that to help top up the till, if you will, to enable more residential energy efficiency to help people drop their bills. And it's just such a beautiful demonstration of what is possible in the context of that rural model. And whether we're talking about, as I do throughout the book, energy efficiency, solar, resilience and energy storage, EVs, and broadband, because you need broadband for clean energy, for distributed energy. Broadband is clean energy technology. There are heroes all over the country working in these small utilities in rural places they're making it happen. And, they're demonstrating models that are replicable across rural America. But I tell you, there's a whole lot of innovation and love and care and connectivity to community that bigger places could learn from too.
Right. So I'm actually going to ask you a question about a semi-rural place. This is from Melissa Everett, who runs Sustainable Hudson Valley. And she's saying that in the Hudson Valley, we have an investor-owned utility, but we're also with really, we have a community that is really committed to the idea of a resilience hub opportunities, which we should describe what a resilience hub is. Why don't we start with describing what a resilience hub is?
Sure. So, resiliency hubs, and I want to uplift Baltimore, actually a big city in this, Baltimore, national leader in community resiliency hubs, y'all. But resiliency hubs are community defined, locations that, provide energy resilience through solar and storage, and also provide for other essential services. And that may be, clean water in case a power outage or an event impacts the water system, food, like baby food, refrigeration for refrigerated medicines like insulin, to help people weather the storms, weather outages or other events where the community needs to come together to stay safe, and ultimately to be able to improve the ability of the community to recover after the outage event is over.
And have you seen, is there a difference between the resilience hubs that are growing out of the co-ops, and do you see any resilience hubs growing out of the investor-owned utilities?
Yes, on both counts. And one of the foundational principles, in rural renaissance, and even thinking about, how do we build local energy futures? And Jonathan, this is something that we talked about ages ago with Ari. But we don't have just one future, right? We have futures. It's plural. And to paraphrase our friend Ari Wallach, futuring is also something that we do. We're building a future every day towards a goal. It's not something that just happens to us. And when we think about our energy futures, our energy futures in Georgia are different than in the Hudson Valley, or different than in Arkansas, or different than in Iowa. And while we all may share a same goal that we're moving toward, at the same North Star, we want a healthy climate for the future, to love and care for ourselves and our neighbors and our future generations and our planet. We're going to get there in different ways. And one of the reasons for that is because America, energy federalism. You know, the energy policy landscape in America is like federalism on display. So we all got different rules. It shapes our markets in different ways. And that's okay, because we all have different blessings too. You know, the built environment and also sort of optimal land use and, you know, resource use, and each state is going to be a little bit different. So, you know, investor-owned utilities can be very, very important partners in building for resilience. Not only do they have the data, you know, if you will, and they understand their grid and their infrastructure, but sometimes building for resilience, you know, especially installing not just little batteries like you would put on your house, but distribution scale batteries that might like keep the lights on for a campus or keep the lights on for a hospital, can actually help to reduce infrastructure costs for utilities. So there's a avoided cost benefit of installing energy storage. And that's something that, you know, I've heard anecdotally from friends and colleagues who work in investor-owned utilities that they're, for instance, it's cheaper and easier to put a battery in than it is to build a new substation. Plus, nobody likes to look at all those wires. And electric co-ops, not just like Curtis's or Roanoke Electric Cooperative in North Carolina, but a group of co-ops in Texas have demonstrated how cost-effective, how economically beneficial, you know, it can be to build for resilience. You know, so you've got resiliency hubs, but you know what, it's saving the utility money too. And you kind of need the utility as a partner because they realize an important economic benefit from that infrastructure. And then that benefit can be shared back with the community.
Right.
You know, so it's really about kind of, and I think about it from a principle perspective, stepping back, counting your blessings, you know, seeing what you have in abundance, and then stacking that stuff together in a way that works in your state regulatory market and that meets the community's needs.
Speaking of community needs again, these co-ops have boards.
Yes.
And so people can actually show up and change the policy of their co-ops if they wanted to.
They can. And I think that the understanding the role of, you know, energy democracy and sort of design intent versus operation, you know, to use perhaps a somewhat butchered built environment term, is something that we need to think about, especially if we're local residents and members of a cooperative or of a municipal utility. Because if we think back in history, and I would say, like, when I think about from a faith perspective, loving my neighbor as myself, who's my neighbor? You know, it's not just my neighbor, you know, my neighborhood. It's not just my city or even my country or my planet today. It's generations past and present. You know, so decisions that our communities, that our family members, that our leaders made in the past, in fact, impact our people, you know, our lives today. So we have to take some ownership. You know, if I were thinking about my, you know, Baptist upbringing, it's like it's the multi-generational impacts of sin, right? It doesn't end, you know, just with the person who does something bad. And our co-ops, as beautiful as they are, as beautiful as the promise of energy, you know, of local energy futures are, they were also instituted at the same time that redlining became the law of the land. So while we were creating these like cooperative, awesome, you know, locally owned and led, self-determining co-ops, we were also making it policy, government policy, not to lend money into Black and brown communities. And so we have to recognize that sort of we had a beautiful promise that was originating at a time when we were still doing many, many terrible things. And so the multi-generational impacts of what were explicitly racist policies have got to be unteased from the operation of these institutions today. And one of the legacies that we see, and there's a lot of research from some great organizations on this that, you know, that I cite in the book, way more footnotes than I ever thought I would use, y'all. But 90+% of the rural electric cooperative boards, you know, that were studied in this research, you know, their membership was 90+% white and male. You know, and in some cases, there are instances where board membership was being like passed down from father to son. And, you know, individual people may be good, but you end up with a situation where the leadership of an institution that is literally member owned and operated, not just according to its articles of incorporation, but according to like US tax code and federal law, isn't representative of the community it serves and isn't connected, you know, and sometimes suffer from deliberate election processes on those boards that prevent other voices from coming to the table. So I think that the getting back to first principles, in all things, systems produce values or outcomes according to the values they're grounded on. Stepping back, appreciating the values, that are enshrined in these institutions, and then stepping forward, in unity. To align governance with community and outcomes and potential, can have beautiful results and is often needed.
So I want to pick up on that point about systems producing the outcomes that reflect the values that are in the system. And you used the Christian phrase of sin and said that it reverberates throughout generations, but also the Christian concept of love and the concept of grace can reverberate throughout generations. So talk about how you see that happening.
So I want to tell another story about Curtis. And this is a story that I just feel so grateful, to be able to share in Rural Renaissance. Curtis was the very first Black CEO of a rural electric cooperative and the very first Black elected president of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And he was in that position for 2 years, when George Floyd was murdered and when unrest, swept the country. And Curtis, in his leadership position, recognized that, diversity, equity, inclusion were all absolutely consistent with the 7 cooperative principles. And again, these are international principles that cooperatives all over the world are founded on. And Curtis, with the support of his colleagues on the board, and ultimately with unanimous consent of all those leaders from all those boards across all those 900 and something rural electric cooperatives everywhere across America, unanimous consent, the NRECA adopted a DEI policy. And so when you talk about grace and you talk about working together in unity, towards goals that we all share, there's not just a beautiful example in Curtis's leadership, but also a beautiful platform, that's now there for other communities to work together and follow.
Mm. And you had a story about Martha Jane.
Yes, Martha Jane Murray. So, another epicenter of energy innovation and leadership is Arkansas. Arkansas, not just Little Rock, which I guess is kind of a small, big town, but Ouachita, Arkansas. And I think I probably pronounced that wrong. I keep on getting corrected about it. Maybe someone on this webinar is sitting there being like, man, she said that wrong. But Martha Jane Murray is a green building innovator. And Martha Jane's from Arkansas. She and her husband own a shoe factory there. If you've seen the shoes that have like Gustav Klimt, women's shoes that have the Gustav Klimt paintings on the toe, I think Martha Jane's husband's shoe factory makes those things. But rural Arkansas, like in so many places, is severely burdened, when it comes to energy costs. And through her work, she developed a program with her husband in which essentially the shoe factory, was able to provide revolving loan to employees to be able to improve the energy efficiency of their homes. And through a journey that passed through New Orleans after Katrina, and it has many other heroes associated with it as well. Like Tammy Agard, who's the woman founder, co-founder and CEO of eUtility, ultimately ended up pioneering the very first on-bill energy efficiency programs through a format that became pays, that's saving families 30-50% on their energy bills. So and there's another example.
You got to explain
yes, sir.
You got to explain what an on-bill energy efficiency program is.
Oh, okay. So on-bill program. So I know a lot of us may be familiar, especially us energy and climate geeks, familiar with like commercial PACE or with and one of the challenges with loans or using tax liens is that people who rent or people who don't have credit can't really access those tools. Even if they did have credit, carrying another loan on your personal balance sheet hurts your credit, makes it harder for you to do everything else. And so, being able to invest in energy efficiency, put in a new air conditioning unit, improve your weatherization in your home, do weather sealing, that gets paid for with energy savings over time. Like that's the economic case, right? As my mama would say, I save more than I spend. You save more than you spend. But doing that as debt is a challenge if you're strapped for funds. And the utility, however, can finance those kinds of solutions on bill because they're the whole transaction, right? They're sending you the bill, they can give you the bill credit, and it makes it easy for them to do the math and make sure it nets out at the end of the day. So it was rural electric cooperatives, including Roanoke and Ouachita Electric Cooperative, which is also headed up by a visionary CEO who's doing all the clean energy things in rural Arkansas, were the ones who first showed how that could be done and demonstrated that energy services, like energy efficiency, is consistent with the public purpose of a cooperative utility.
So we need, as a world today, 23 terawatts of power. It's a lot of power. And ultimately, solar and wind conflict with other uses, particularly natural uses, but they don't have to. So let's talk about agrovoltaics.
More rural innovation. And this stuff is just cool too. Agrovoltaics are just cool. So, when you're talking about competition for land use, you've got this beautiful farmland and you're going to put solar panels on it. Is it going to end up being kind of industrial? Is it going to impact our ability to grow the food that we need to maintain our resilience? Those two things don't have to come into conflict. And one of the pioneers, who's researching those solutions is Greg Barron Gifford, who is out of Arizona. He's a wonderful researcher there and working on and contributing on research projects of a whole global network, of folks who are focused on agrovoltaics. And what is an agrovoltaics? Pretty simple concept. Instead of having a ground mounted solar panel that's sort of down here that you have to cut grass under, you raise the solar panel and then you can plant crops underneath it. And there are many places in the country, even in the world, in the US today, there's a demonstration at a place called Jack's Solar Garden in Colorado, that's showing that not only can you have a dual land use essentially, but that by planting crops like lettuces, even tomatoes under solar panels, you can increase crop yields while also improving the efficiency of the solar array itself. Because the plants, the vegetation is helping to keep the solar panels cooler, which makes them more efficient. Now, this is neat and nifty and everything, but it also becomes important because of climate change. Where you have places that are hotter, for instance, or drier, or where the rain comes in great deluges and then it's dry in between. The climate's just kind of weird and more extreme. It also helps, the idea of agrovoltaics can also help make land fertile and useful for longer. It can preserve its agricultural purposes because you can still grow stuff because those solar panels kind of shade the plants and help prevent so much evaporation, right? So you have to water less. And there's just a tremendous amount of scientific study behind this that's answering questions like, what are the best agricultural products to pair with solar in different places? Growing up, my mama and I'd always talked about the three sisters because you plant corn, beans, and squash together. And they all kind of like one another and hang out and keep so many bugs from getting at the vegetables. And you can throw solar in as a fourth sister.
Ooh, I like that. The fourth sister. Okay, so I'm going to go to some questions that we have. So the first one is about the great state of Florida, where PPAs are not allowed. You should describe what a PPA is, power purchase agreement. And FPL in general just makes it hard for people to do anything independently.
And it's the Sunshine State, though, y'all. It's the sunshine state.
Yeah.
Use that sunshine. PPA is a power purchase agreement. And, a power purchase agreement enables, people or companies to buy 20 years, of solar energy, if you will, from solar panels that you don't own. And a power purchase agreement is usually the way that residential customers, put solar on their roof. And it's typically the way that big corporations buy large amounts of clean energy from big solar farms that they don't own. And one kind of financially geeky thing that I'll share about that is, a major reason that PPAs are so widely utilized is because, very much like affordable housing, solar and renewable energy generally is tax credit finance. The primary federal incentive or subsidy, depending on how you see the world, is a tax credit that's worth 30% of the value of the project. I have many thoughts on tax credits and what they do to ownership of assets. But, bottom line is that PPAs are a way to transfer those savings to people who aren't able to use the tax credits. And, in markets like Florida that are regulated, the utility are the only entities that can sell electrons. They're the only ones who can sell power. And again, it sort of depends on your perspective, but from my own point of view, not having a market in place, an effective competitive market in place, that allows people to express their energy property rights, if you will. Like if you own your own roof, you put a solar panel on it. It's property rights. Hello, really limits the ability of people to be able to own their own power. And, some considerations, though, and some things that are moving forward in places like Florida, though, is, considering the impact of resilience. Regardless of how each state determines, on its own, given our federalist marketplace, to compose its energy policy market, it's kind of a who does what in what lane set of questions, right? And it doesn't have to be the same answer everywhere in the country. Everybody has needs. And in Florida, obviously, there's a need for resilience. Florida has some of the toughest building codes in the country because of the need to be able to withstand hurricanes and storms, and increasing frequency of storms knocks the power out a good bit too. And so, similar to the ability to, consider working in upstate New York and the Hudson Valley with an IOU, just like we've worked very collaboratively with BG&E, and we're working collaboratively with colleagues at Georgia Power to think about not just, solar as solar panels and solar electrons, but to think about it as localized resilience. How do you pair solar panels with batteries and energy storage to increase the resiliency of community members, in alignment with what their priorities are, but also ultimately to increase the resilience of the grid. So there are always ways, I believe, even though I think in the, the broader environment that we can work in, we don't see a lot of examples of unity. But unity is always something that we can find. Particularly, it doesn't matter how different your perspectives are on how many different subjects. There are ways that we can all move and work together, and coming to the table with love, with love for our neighbors, with love for the places that we live, with care, for prosperity and well-being is needing to be a part of a sustainable future too. We can find pathways through these hard arguments.
That'd be great. What's interesting to me about these rural co-ops, which may listen better than the investor-owned systems. I have a friend who made a call in Florida to try and get access to solar power, and the person who answered the phone said, "You must be one of those winter guys that comes down from up north, because we only get these calls from you. Like, you northerners are able to just decide, where the electrons come from, but we don't do that here." So an interesting question somebody said is, are there any resistance to installing clean energy in rural areas that you've seen has slowed down this growth? Because what you're really talking about, as you said, is energy property rights and energy democracy.
Well, and people being able to self-determine their futures. And, there's a lot of, local, local independence and self-reliance, that's a part of the equation too. I think that there's an important instructive story from North Carolina to consider there. I was grateful to be able to share a table not too long ago, with a number of center-right legislators from North Carolina. And, the topic of conversation was clean energy and solar and resilience. And many of the rural legislators around the table were really concerned about the large scale solar that was in their district, because it had taken beautiful agricultural land and turned it into gravel ballasted. So gravel ballasted means you scrape off the topsoil, gravel, solar panels, so you don't have to mow it. And the projects were all owned by faraway investors. And they were concerned not just about the impact on the landscape, but 20, 30 years from now, are those faraway investors really going to come take their stuff and restore the land? There are a lot of, there are a lot of local, everything's local, right? There are a lot of local issues and local concerns that have to be understood and also respected. Because just like any kind of infrastructure, any kind of development, if you're coming in and you're the owner, or you're the developer of that system, and you don't do right by the local neighborhood, no one's going to like you, and no one's going to want more of your stuff. And so I think the extent to which, the solar sector and, developers, and I would add advocates, that are looking to make room or make space through renewable portfolio standards or shared goals or incentives or subsidies, or, whatever the flavor is. We've got to respect and love the people and places that we're serving. And, so long as we're taking that time to be a part of the community, and to understand, how do we express love for our neighbors through our energy systems? How do we make sure that in a clean energy transition that we're not creating a clean energy dystopia, where we've got clean power and clean electrons, yay, but we're impoverishing people or places in the process. We did that once. We already did that with fossil fuels, y'all. Fossil fuels were a blessing at the time, but we failed to make course corrections, as we began to understand what their health and well-being impacts were on people and planet. And here we are again, transitioning our energy systems, just like we transition from, killing whales and burning their flesh to keep the lights on in cities, to using coal and steam. We've got to take that same responsibility of care, as we drive this clean energy transition too. It's up to us. It's up to our generation. What we do is going to impact the world for hundreds, if not thousands a year ahead. And it's a blessing to have that responsibility. It's a blessing to be able to do good and do good by your neighbor. And that's the spirit in which we should approach this.
Yeah. One of the question comments says, Cornel West said, justice is what love looks like in public. So this is what you're really describing is justice, that is love in public. And it looks like community-owned solar or local utilities, but it is love for the earth, and it is love for humans by reducing their energy bills significantly and giving them a more sustainable life.
And love for communities by making sure people can pay their bills and raise their families and live where they want to live and have a prosperous life,
right.
And look forward to a more prosperous life for their kids too. So, sustainability, Ray Anderson, is one of my mentors, one of my heroes, one of many of our heroes probably, and Ray always talked about doing well by doing good. It had to be people, it had to be plan, it had to be profit. There's nothing wrong with profit. You need, that's
You know what? Let's talk about Ray for a second, because Ray was the head of, I don't know if he founded it, but it was the head of Interface Carpet, which is a carpet company in LaGrange, Georgia, and changed the world. He literally changed the world of carpet making, and he changed the world of industrial thinking. um, from this little town in Georgia, which shows the leverage of the great ideas. So briefly tell the Ray Anderson story.
Yeah, so I got my start in sustainability working for Ray Anderson at Interface. And at the time, it was mid 1990s. I will tell y'all, and I ain't ashamed, it was living out my absolute worst nightmare to, come back to my hometown of LaGrange, Georgia, and go to work for a textile company after, going off to DC and getting my fancy graduate degree. But it is probably the biggest blessing of my entire professional life. And it put me on the path I'm on today. I got to see, at my hometown, and Ray was the founder of Interface, founder and CEO and chairman and world changer. I went to work for the company as the director of e-business because y'all, it was 1996. And I got to see up close how, Ray's conviction, it really was a personal spiritual conviction about the impact that he was having on the environment as an industrialist, that transformed Interface, that transformed so many things about my hometown and my community, and that completely permeated that organization. And as a publicly traded company, and being the first CEO to put a stake in the ground and say, "This is what I'm doing, y'all." He made the way for CSR, ESG, all these corporate sustainability commitments that are being made now, which at the time was extraordinarily risky, because Wall Street wasn't so sure about sustainability at the time. And it just fundamentally formed me, as a professional and as a citizen, to see how he did it, and just always making sure that people, planet, profit, were aligned. If you drop any leg of that stool, tips over.
So just, I know it's a little off the electrification story, but what Ray did is he actually completely reimagined carpet from floor covering to a service. And he said, I'm going to take back the carpets I put out and recycle them. I'm going to make them with renewable power on the factories. I'm going to reduce my water usage by like 90%. I'm going to get the toxics out of the water. I mean, this guy completely transformed how carpets are made and used. He did carpet tiles in America. The company's profitable. He unfortunately passed away. The company's even greener now than it was when he passed away. And he just changed. And now, by the way, every carpet company has to compete with this, so they're all green. So it just shows how it may be even easier to do. I don't want to say it's easier to do it anywhere, but in a rural system, there may be more community and less competition. Anyway.
Well, and Ray always said, you change the world one mind at a time, one mind at a time. And something that a lot of folks don't know is that one of the things that Ray did and that his management team did even early on was he tied everybody's annual bonus to sustainability goals. It wasn't just about growth. There were measures and metrics. And so it wasn't just about the money and the bonus. It was, again, about connecting an experience with how you impacted the goals that everybody shared together that showed up in your paycheck. And that connection, it wasn't just the C-suite that cared, right? It wasn't just some marketing story on the cover of a brochure. It was an experience that every single person in that organization had through their shared work, whether you were the CEO or whether you were sweeping the factory floor on the third shift. And the impact that he had an employer on my community, on my home, where I'm sitting right now, it continues to today.
Right. If all goes well, this weekend, maybe even, the Inflation Reduction Act will pass and bring an enormous amount of resources towards energy efficiency. Is there a pathway within that for the rural communities?
Always. I mean, Joe Manchin is many things, and he is an extraordinary champion for rural communities, coming from West Virginia. And, I think that for everyone, regardless of what your politics are, regardless of what your feelings are about the legislation, I would say this from a local perspective: get the money and bring it home. Right? Get the money and bring it home. And one of the things that a reflection that I have from my time in federal service, and it's something that I hadn't appreciated until I was at the White House, initially at CEQ and then at the Office of Management and Budget, go ONB alum. But the federal government has a lot of good ideas and intentions, and the federal government has a lot of resources too. But it can be very, very hard to connect those resources and those ideas to local communities. And, for local communities, especially rural communities and smaller towns that have less capacity, I mean, just straight up, they have fewer people working for institutions. And so there's not anybody to write the 100-page grant application. It's much, much harder to bring those resources to the places that really need them, especially since federal funding is often formula-based. And then it gets redistributed. It's a wholesale game, essentially. It's formula-based. It goes to states and big cities, and the money goes out from there. Or it's competitive grants with very, very rigorous application administrative requirements. And for those folks on the call today, or who may be listening afterwards, if you're from a small town, if you work with small towns, or if you're at a nonprofit institution, an academic institution, and you know what, you know how to get yourself some USDA and DOE grants, think about who you can partner with. Think about partnership with your co-op. Think about partnerships with local small municipalities and county governments, because oftentimes they're extraordinary ideas, but there just maybe a lack of enough bodies, a lack of enough FTE, to successfully go after the work. And I would put a challenge out there too, to my colleagues that I've worked alongside for, these 25 plus years now, which freaks me out, in energy and sustainability. There has been such a focus for so very long, and I understand why, of just pollution reduction, counting tons of GHGs out of the atmosphere. And I remember, I guess it was in the early 2000s, it was all about cities, because cities were the McKinsey curve or whatever, 70% or 75% of the GHG emissions reductions needs would come from urban activity. But we have to see and understand and get to know and show care and love for our rural neighbors and our rural communities too. So, don't just think about the investments from, the Inflation Reduction Act or the Infrastructure Act or any of the other acts, and funds and opportunities that are out there. Think about people and think about the places that, not just the places that need it most, and prioritize love and care, for our neighbors, but think too about coexistence and mutuality. Mutuality, Jonathan, I think that's the term that you used. Cities get their resources from the country. Even coal comes from the country, and it powered cities. You can have extractive, imbalanced economic relationships, or you can have balanced relationships that are working in harmony, so that needs of urban economic activities are being met equitably in a way that shares value, in a way that's loving and thoughtful, with the rural communities where those resources are originating. That's true with big solar farms feeding big city clean energy appetites too. That's true of big corporations wanting to buy renewable energy from rural communities to feed their urban or suburban data centers. But there's just a bigger picture here that we can all see an impact no matter what seat we sit in every day from 9 to 5.
So, by the way, I've just put in the chat a book called Donut Economics, which really is in part about this question about how do we create a balanced and more mutual-based economic system. And I'm increasingly believing that is really an essential part of the solutions that we need. At the Garrison Institute, we call this, growing the common good, and within that is the idea of the commons. That business is a powerful tool. It's one that I use, but it's only a tool. We've made it the predominant. It should be a tool, not the system itself. And to me, the system really needs to be one built upon the mutuality. And that's what ecosystems are. We've learned that's what forests are. That's what indigenous communities typically were, a mutualistic, relational view. That's actually what works. That's the way nature made things. And we need to create more mutual systems, I think. And my sense is in our smaller communities where there's more self-reliance, but there's also more collective reliance on each other. That's where we have a better chance of bringing these forward.
And I think to that point, I'm sorry, that had a little blip in my internet connection here, but it's about relationships. And, I mean, talking about the economy, Jonathan, I mean, we often don't talk about it this way, but people don't serve the economy. The economy serves people. We have to think about what's the dominant relationship, right? It's like the needs of people and communities that are served not by the economy. It's not some sort of idolatrous other way around. And, by regrounding ourselves in our community values, and our care for people, and thinking about, as we're deploying renewable energy, how can renewable energy and clean energy efficiency, resilience, EVs, all the things, how can it create healthier, more prosperous futures for our communities? And, as someone who loves rural places, y'all, I didn't think this way when I was 21. I certainly think that looking at 50, I much prefer to live in a smaller town. There are many, many more people, especially after COVID, who prefer to live in a place with a little bit more room. Let's just make sure that we take this moment to, to pour in to rural America, and to show our love and care for our country too. There's a deep agricultural traditions across every state in America. Let's love agriculture with agrovoltaics. Let's love those neighbors that are extraordinarily energy burdened with energy efficiency and resilience. And as we create this huge mashup of giant industries, right? The energy industry's transformation meets the electrification of the transportation sector. When we think about the billions and even trillions of wealth they're going to be created as those two industries collide and transform, let's make sure that wealth, is pouring back into the places that are generating the power and making the cars too.
Michelle, that's a beautiful way to end. So thank you. It's been such a joy listening to you and reading your book. Before we begin, I told Michelle it's a really well-written book. She's a great writer, and it's a pleasure to read, and I encourage you all to buy it and give it to your friends. So thank you so much for joining us for this enlightening conversation. And to the audience, thank you so much for joining us today. Remember, our forums are offered free of charge, but we love donations. And I actually look at all the donations that come in. So we would love it if you would make a donation to the Garrison Institute to support this forum and the many others and support our work. The next one we're going to have is September 27th with Nicole Redvers on Bridging Indigenous Systems and Modern Science. Bridging Indigenous Systems and Modern Science. So please join us for that. And look at the Garrison Institute website calendar for not only the Pathways to Planetary Health talks, but many, many other wonderful things. Thanks so much all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Bye.